Today we'll be talking about a different kind of learning, the deep work of healing and transformation. I'm Ben Hufana, for those who don't already know. And so starting out, in our culture here that we know that we've grown up in our modern day world, we're taught how to, from kindergarten through high school, those of us who pursue higher education, even when we go into the professional world, we're taught to listen and follow instructions. Listen to our teachers, our instructors, and even once we start working, to our professional peers who have more experience and those who work for, so that we can succeed. And I'm sure we all know of other kids when we were growing up who didn't listen, didn't follow instructions, acted out. And uh, we also know where some of them are now, how that's worked out for them, which is often not too well. But but when it comes to well, I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to train with Horace Dulkai, who is one of the last surviving traditional doctors among the Kiowa Indian tribe. And at what 17, I'd taken off on my own and landed in this community, predominantly Kiowa Indians, and was sitting up all night in peyote meetings with the native elders, and Horace took me as an apprentice, leaving out some of the details just for brevity. But he would transmit portions of his own healing gifts to me, and then he'd have me fasting alone without the food and water. The vision quests, you typically go about 4 days and nights with no food, no water, alone in the mountains, and that's what you go through in order to earn the right to work with these gifts of healing. And with Horace, it was critically important for me to listen and follow instructions, because were I not to do so, I could potentially harm myself, or even as I was learning to work with, initially I would assist him when he was working with his patients. But over time, I began to work on my own. So I needed to listen carefully in order to learn how to work with these gifts of healing and work with them in a way that was correct, or a healthy way. And then Horace was, by far, like, one of the most powerful doctors, native doctors or medicine men of the past century. I think he was born in the late 1920s or something, and there were many instances where people suffering from cancer, leukemia, or other diseases that had gone through a conventional medical route, and they weren't able to do anything for them, and yet they'd go to Horace and he would work with them. And I mean, it was amazing to watch Horace. I mean, he would do things like, he would throw a black handkerchief over the person's head while they were standing, and he would push in on the carotid arteries, and he would be like just staring, into the person, looking into them. And in less than a minute, he could see what was going on in their body, and he would describe in great, intricate detail what was happening in terms of their physiology. And a lot of Native Americans in those days, they didn't go that far in terms of formal education. He was shipped off to World War II in his latter teens, and even when I was working with him, he still had pieces of German shrapnel in his back um, from combat. But even though he didn't have the formal education, he could describe in such intricate detail exactly what was going on physiologically in a person's body. And now I'm allergic to bee and wasp stings. And there was one time where I got stung on the wrist and my wrist was badly swollen. And he puts his hand on my wrist and the swelling starts dissipating. My wrist went all the way down to normal size within like just a couple of minutes. His wrist starts swelling up. He takes that swelling into his own wrist, and in about 30 minutes, his went back down to normal. He did just all kinds of, facilitated just astounding, mind blowing, just healing on different individuals. I was fortunate to have the opportunity to observe and to work with him, and as I said, he was transmitting portions of his healing gifts to me, and then having me go on the vision quest. There were times with Horace that we'd get into an argument about something, and Horace was so he knew what I was going to say before the words came out of my mouth. And before I could even begin to speak, he would rebut my arguments. So on one hand, I was like angry, and on the other hand, I was trying not to laugh. We'd be riding cross country, and we could ride for hours sometimes without saying a word. But there were moments where he was a bit more animated and engaged, and he would be like describing events that had occurred at different periods in my life, is as if he were just watching a movie on the screen, and he would be describing everything that happened in such intricate detail, and you could not hide anything from him. Now, years later, after a few too many mugging attempts in New York City, and last time nearly getting arrested because I had pepper spray and chased the attacker down the street, the at that point I was thinking, wow, I better find someone to train with. so uh, and so I started training with this Chinese master Shifu Li Tailiang, and Shifu was uh, had attained very high level of mastery and the internal martial arts. I mean, he started training at the age of 5. Xingyi Quan, Baguazhang primarily, and then Tai Chi, Qigong. And in the internal martial arts, there's like the external disciplines or martial arts, primary influence is on speed and technique and form and all that. And that's part of the internal as well. The internal martial arts are rooted in Taoism. And so there are these esoteric practices through which one continually draws this life force from the heavens and the earth into one's body, drawing that life force in, directing it through certain pathways, and concentrating it into certain areas, what they refer to as the Dantian, building that force or that power, that bioelectrical charge. And Shifu, having done these practices for years, from the time he was 5, and then getting up, into his late teens and 20s. And so by the time, I think he's in his 20s, by the time he's doing the competing in the tournaments, and there were instances where in just one strike, he would knock his opponent completely unconscious, utilizing that internal power. And even the judges were dumbfounded, seeing what had just happened. And Shifu was telling me at one point, the judge walks up to him and just says, "What kind of kung fu are you doing?" Even the judge didn't get it, because the internal martial arts, they're not as common as what's normally referred to as the external disciplines. So the judge wasn't all that aware of what, or cognizant of what Shifu was doing there. Shifu was telling me about one incident where China for some time was fairly lawless, when it went through that transitional period after Chairman Mao's death. And there's an instance on a Shifu was on a bus, and he actually worked for some time training uh, recruits in the police academy in Beijing. And so there was an altercation that started on a bus, and then it spilled over outside of the bus. And it turned out there were 4 escaped convicts, and they were armed with knives and meat cleavers, and they were surrounding Shifu, and he took all 4 of them down. And then the police recruits that he was training, once he would take each one down, they would subdue them, and then they just waited until the police arrived and carted them off. So both Horace and Shifu Li Tailiang had, in their own disciplines, had attained extraordinarily high levels of mastery. And yet, being human, as we all are, there were aspects of them that were very mundane, pretty comparable to all the rest of us. And sometimes I could sense, as I was interacting with them, that they were coming from, let's say, their less evolved selves. And so there were times when maybe they were offering some opinion or telling me I should do something or other, and I was being very sensitive, and I could just feel in my body, it's like, no, that's not really in my best interest. That's not what I need to do. And I would just say, no, I'm not going to do that. And I would stand my ground. I could sense that they were a little displeased with me, but no, I'm not going to just blindly go along with everything. And Horace even confronted me at one point. Initially I was going along with everything. He said, "Hey, if you're so easily manipulated, I don't know if you're the right person to handle this kind of power." And so it kind of shocked me. But then I went to the other end, and when I started standing up to him and confronting him on things. So, but yeah, it's important because there was it 1960s or so when a lot of some of the gurus started coming over from India, and some Tibetan lamas, Sufi masters, people of other ancient spiritual traditions, and you had people being like groupies and just flocking to them, and this kind of blind allegiance or something, and that can be very dangerous. There's old folk proverb or something says, "Make yourself into a sheep, and there will be a wolf behind the next tree." So we do need to exercise our critical thinking faculties and not just follow blindly, and realize that even though someone possesses tremendous gifts or healing powers or capabilities, that ultimately they're still wounding. I would say that the greatest abuse was, I would see some of these individuals, some of the gurus and those in other ancient spiritual traditions, is that they were just seducing their followers. And there's one instance, let's see, Yogi Bhajan, he was like leading this contingent of American Sikhs, and he was telling his devotees to be celibate. And I remember speaking with one of his devotees, and he said it, it was pretty tough for him when he wasn't married. Telling him, if you're not married, be celibate. And he was telling me at one point, he said, even the rug was looking really sensual to me. and and yet Yogi Bhajan was like porking a few of his devotees of choice and keeping it hidden. And Yogi Bhajan himself was married and stuff. There was all kinds of uh, criminal allegations that later came out there around Yogi Bhajan, and it's sad too, because you go years back and you hear a lot of these accounts of some of these Indian gurus and decades past, and way back there, it was I'm talking like say 80 or more years ago, and there are a lot of individuals that possessed just extraordinary gifts or powers that you'd hear of instances where some of them were able to what they call bilocate. I mean, they would appear in more than one location at a time. Um, they were just, again, extraordinary capabilities, and but they were just so incredibly disciplined. They were just doing hours and hours of intensive pranayama, kundalini type practices, other um, highly refined meditation practices, continually developing their bodies and minds. And yes, they did have a following in a sense, but usually the following was smaller. And there was a certain reverence, but it was about the hard work of truly transforming oneself, of evolving to continually higher levels of development in your body, your mind, spiritually. So it was very much a discipline and a science. Whereas today, I see some of the gurus that they travel on a circuit, and there are these mass followings, and I've gone to some of these events, and it just feels like a circus to me. It's like people are just running around mindlessly, and I just feel all the shit that's coming out of people's bodies. And it just feels very ungrounded, and there's sadly a lot of toxic drama and scandal in those circles, in that arena. So both with Shifu Li Tailiang and Horace, I needed to use discernment. I used discernment in order to determine, like, okay, this is when he's in that less evolved self, and other times I could sense when they were really coming from that place of mastery, and I needed to be able to tune in and know when to listen to them. And I use this capacity that I have. I'm always sensing and tuning into different individuals. If someone has something of value to offer, I could sense when someone's coming from a really wounded place, when someone's spewing bullshit, or I can, it's sad these days. There's so much misinformation, or more accurately, disinformation that's being spewed. And a lot of people just get sucked into it and they buy into it. And they're basically useful idiots serving the agendas of people who are purposefully manipulating their minds. But conversely, as we go through our own healing, we heal our own emotional wounds, we become more grounded, we develop a stronger foundation, we develop that greater, these empathic capabilities, and we develop our intuition, this deeper knowing we could really sense when somebody's really plugged in, when they have certain gifts or capabilities. And at these times, it's so important to listen. In China, there are many highly developed martial artists, attained extraordinarily high levels of mastery. And these individuals, would have uh, small numbers of select students. There might be larger numbers of, a group of students that they were training, but they would maybe have just a few individuals. And some, that's all they did. They just worked with a select few individuals. And so I first started training with Shifu Li Taliang in 2002, and and I was attending his classes with all these other students, but I didn't feel like I was really getting the full benefit. It was hard for me to grasp or understand a lot of what he was teaching, the practices. I just wasn't connecting the dots. And so I asked him if I could train with him individually. And so I started going to work with Shifu, uh, traveling a good distance to his home. And I would see him week after week after week when I was in and around New York City. And of all the students that Shifu worked with, for some reason, he decided to open up and share with me like a lot of the uh, practices and applications that he normally doesn't teach to his larger body of students. There's He would teach this, again, the larger body of students, a more general form of the practice and a few applications thereof. And yet there's what they refer to as closed door students, which may sound a little funny, but what it means is that they teach you behind closed doors, which means they're teaching you in secret. They are teaching you in private. They're teaching you practices and applications that they normally do not share, that they normally do not pass on or impart to other students. And so Shifu would be teaching me like a lot of internal Qigong practices, to build this greater internal power. He'd be showing me the various fighting forms, and then he would show me very specific applications, like if you're in a situation you have to defend yourself, you're in combat, well, how can you actually utilize this form? And there were a lot of these specific applications that were very guarded. Like a lot of these masters, they didn't show them very often. They were largely hidden and unknown to the vast majority of people, or the vast majority of humanity, for instance. But Shifu was sharing or imparting a lot of this, like these the secret knowledge, these practices and the applications thereof. And but in working with Shifu and training with them, it was so crucial for me to listen to what he had to say and to closely follow instruction, and for a number of reasons. One, like doing the qigong practices, if I'm not doing them correctly, they're not going to work as good for me, and um, they're not going to be as effective when it comes to developing that internal power. A lot of these practices can be very challenging for the physical body, and so you have to be very careful how you do them, because if you go about it stupidly, you're not listening and you're not paying attention, you're not following instructions, you can do some real damage to yourself. You can blow out your knees, or you could do other horrible things to injure yourself. And there are some martial artists who have had to stop practicing because they sustain these long-term injuries. And there's also the concern about, even if you're in a situation where you're having to defend yourself, there are certain applications that you don't do unless it's just a life or death matter or something. I mean, if you could potentially snap somebody's neck, or you can cause permanent brain injuries or something like that. And so, yeah, it's training with Shifu. I also, there's the importance of being able to being open and receptive to what he has to offer me, but also it's important for me to closely listen and follow instructions in the training that I do with him. From kindergarten, those who all through our primary education, those who go on to pursue a higher education, if we go to trade school, if we move into our professional life, we're taught to listen and follow instruction. And yet, many people, when it comes to working with the gifted healer, such as myself, one of the other, say, if you had the opportunity to venture into the Amazon and work with some of the indigenous healer doctors there, or working with someone in the other ancient traditional cultures, and some of these ancient lineages who has attained mastery. Many people just don't really have the context in which to really learn or grasp what is being offered and to derive the benefit. I mean, it requires a completely different kind of openness. And I'll say that when I think it's around, it was seventh grade, I had this, I wasn't doing that well in school in seventh grade. My grades weren't as good. And so there was this African American teacher that, and I find this with a lot of African American folks, is that there's this caring that, I've seen that a lot in New York City. Like a lot of the white folks, if you're ever in the midst of a crisis or someone's in the midst of a crisis, a lot of the white folks just walk right on by, just oblivious, like you're invisible to them. And yet I will see like a lot of African American people, like if someone's in help or need, they'll stop and they'll attend to that individual. Do you need help? What can I do for you? And some white folks do as well, but I find that more common among the African American population. But this, of all my teachers, of all the time that I was going through school, this one teacher noticed, I just wasn't doing that well. And, she reached out to my mom and, she was like, like just told her straight out what was happening. And she just instilled in me like certain study habits. Nobody had really explained that to me before. And once I got that, it's my grades went up. It's at that point which I finally learned how to learn. And I did much better from there on. But again, when it comes to people in our modern day world, it's that they've never been around people who have attained mastery in these traditions, and people who possess these different gifts or kinds of powers that have been passed down over hundreds or even thousands of years. And so there's really not that understanding of how to learn and how to heal and evolve, how to truly benefit. And it's the importance to be able to be open and vulnerable on that emotional level, to open up to these parts of yourself, say, that are very deeply wounded, and even to be open, receptive to other kinds of forces or powers. And that may sound kind of out there or something to people in our mainstream culture who haven't experienced it. And yet, among indigenous groups of people and those of that come from other ancient indigenous or ancient traditional cultures where they have these intact traditions that go back thousands of years, this is like normal everyday life. You know, here in our modern day world, we don't have access to that. You know, is that hasn't been a part of our culture. It's like we haven't known that. And so, as I said, a lot of people just haven't really known how to learn and approach these things. I used to teach classes on a weekly basis right up until we went into lockdown from COVID, and our whole world just was upended. And it's still not. I don't know it'll ever be back quite to what it was. I mean, it's we're not in lockdown, obviously, but things are quite different. And so I'd have people show up, all kinds of issues. Many were struggling in their relationships, either um, very toxic relationship, maybe with an abusive partner, someone that was causing them a lot of hurt. Others in the midst of a breakup, or maybe just out the other side and they were devastated, or a divorce, or struggling with patterns of abandonment, rejection, unrequited love. Others dealing with health related issues, digestive, respiratory disorders, um, physical injuries, such as those sustained in automobile accidents. These are things that normally respond very well to the form of healing that I facilitate. Again, I'm trained by this traditional Native American doctor. But in many instances, I would, like, at the end of class, I would scan people's bodies and I'm able to look into people's bodies and minds. I could see how they were struggling, how they were wounded. Um, it could be emotionally, it could be, I could see a lot of details about what was going on physically in their body. And I know from past experience, having worked with thousands of people over the years, that a lot of these issues are going to respond very well. But there are times, and this is frustrating working in our mainstream culture and among indigenous peoples, and even when I'd be in India, in Sri Lanka, because people had experienced some kind of point of reference for this kind of healing and had experienced powerful interventions at some point in their life, or had family members or friends who they had a point of reference. But I get people that showed up in my classes, and here in our modern day world, a lot of people have no point of reference, and therefore they have a very limited sense of possibility as to what healing is. Now, in our culture here, in our modern day world, you have a lot of people, and a lot of people have been experienced a great deal of trauma at various points in their lives, many subjected to emotional, verbal, physical traumas, childhood sexual trauma. And what do people do? Commonly, they go into psychotherapy. Now, psychotherapy is, for many of us, a very important part of our healing process. And I sometimes encourage individuals to work with the psychotherapist, because you do need the intellectual understanding, and a good therapist can provide certain skills for self-soothing, certain coping skills, certain skills to help you just function in your life. And yet I was in psychotherapy for a couple of years in my mid to late 20s, and it took me so far. But for me, it wasn't actually healing the actual trauma itself. And but I had to utilize other means. That's when I um, went on and started developing my own system of meditation practices, working with gifted healers, and going on the vision quest. And that's when, through these means, the traumas actually did heal. But for probably the majority of the population here in the United States and our modern day world, they don't know about these things. And so I see people go into therapy and they're just talking about their problems, and it only goes so far. And so you have this huge swath of the population that has this incredibly limited sense of possibility because they just don't know that these other possibilities for healing even exist. And so at times when I would be encouraging these individuals to work with me, they'd say, "Oh, I'll think about it." And then usually what happened is I never saw them again. There were a few that actually ended up calling me and did work with me and got the results, but majority, no, they just disappeared. And it's really sad. I remember there was, I forget the guy's name because a lot of time has passed, but his his much younger Dominican girlfriend had dumped his ass, and he was devastated by it. And I encouraged him to work with me, and he too, like, I'll think about it. Disappeared. I ran into him months later on the subway, and he was. Let me be a little crude here. He was still fucked up. I mean, he was just in a really bad space. Still, months later. I mean, I don't remember, was it 3, 4, 5, maybe longer, months later, and he was still in a really bad space. But I've had people that I'd encounter them, maybe they showed up in my class or someone referred them to me, whatever. And as little as 3 to 5 sessions, and it would just blow them through it. They'd come out the other side, digesting that the whole drama they went through in the relationship, maybe the narcissistic abuse, the hurt, the devastation, all those intense, overwhelming emotions. They come out the other side. And having let go of that individual and the relationship, having processed all those extraordinarily painful emotions, and they're feeling a sense of ease, at peace, they're feeling comforted. And I've watched as many of these individuals over the years went on to attract someone into their life with whom they could co-create a much healthier, more meaningful, and more deeply fulfilling relationship. And I've had other people too, a whole range of physical health related issues. People, just seriously injured in automobile accidents. And one guy is riding in a Jeep and he was hit broadside, and the impact was so great, the seatbelt actually snapped. And he flew out of the Jeep spinning in the air and landed on the ground and slid on the pavement and had this huge road rash on, I think it was his right side. And it's, as I said, he's in a lot of pain. He was hunched over, couldn't walk right. And after the first session, I mean, first time I encountered him, I sat him down in a chair and I just worked for a few minutes, and he was just astounded. He was saying, "Wow, I could feel the pain coming out of my body." And then when I actually went to his house and did a session for him, he was on the table for an hour or more and doing the session. And after that first session, he goes back to work and he's doing construction. And so I'll see these changes. The difference is, you have those people that's like, "Well, I'll think about it." And you have these others who actually follow through and did the work. And they at least were open enough to say, "Okay, I'll give this a chance." Now, another thing that, again, say among Native Americans, like if somebody approaches one of their traditional doctors, they usually prepare an offering for the doctor and say, "I'd really like for you to help me with this particular condition, health issue, or trauma or whatever it is that they were dealing with. And the doctor, uh, would deliberate, decide whether that was something that he or she wanted to take on or was willing to take on. But once the doctor, he or she decided, okay, I'm going to work with you, the doctor would specify, okay, I will work with you. This is what I need you to do in addition in terms of preparation. And we need to do, about so many sessions. It could be give or take a few, but it's a process. It's going to take some time. And so once the doctor agreed to work with their patient, there was commitment on both sides. They took it very seriously. Here in our mainstream culture, there's a real even flakiness in the way people approach healing, just more like a kind of dabbling in healing. Is there's a lack of commitment, a lack of seriousness. And like on one hand, I understand that people kind of want to try something out before they really commit themselves, but I'd have people that um, would say, okay, I'll try out a session. I'll try out a session. But you have these individuals that they have like very serious health related issues. They're dealing with traumatic wounds that are pretty substantial, and yet they're saying to me, I'll try a session and see what I think. The problem is a lot of these people, I mean, first thing, if they really knew, if they really possess the self-awareness, and if they possess the understanding of their own bodies and minds, if they possess the resources that would enable them to facilitate healing of these physiological health issues or conditions, if they had the capacity to affect healing, they would not be in the shape that they were in, the disastrous shape that they were in. But they don't. And a lot of them were in pretty bad shape, but they're telling me um, okay, I'll try out a session and see what I think. And I've responded to a number of these individuals. I've said, okay, well, say you can have the most powerful, the most effective medicinal herbs or nutritional supplements available here on planet Earth. What's going to happen if you take that just one time? What's that going to do for you? I mean, I sincerely hope you have enough common sense about you to realize that you're probably not much of anything. And I'll let them stew with that for a bit, let them process that. And I'll also ask them, it's like, I mean, I'd also like you to consider, like, how long have you been dealing with these issues? I mean, like, most likely, when you think about it, like, okay, you've been dealing with these issues for very likely years or decades, and is it really realistic to think you're going to clear this all up or even see substantial headway in just one session? I mean, when you have this really timid approach to healing, you're just like sticking your toes in the water. You're just, again, what I call dabbling in healing. You're not going to really get all that great of results. And I understand on one hand, like, I was in that position in my mid-20s when a lot of the trauma, the deep emotional wounding of my childhood and adolescence, when that was resurfacing in my mid-20s. But The difference is I would approach these various practices and the work I did with different practitioners in a completely different way. I was very thorough. I mean, there were a few things that I tried out, and I knew it wasn't. I could just feel it wasn't working at all. And some things I did let go of immediately, but for the most part, if I found something that I got a sense either had potential or I could feel some degree of effect, I would really test it out. And often, could be for months even. And by doing so, I really got a sense of what was working and what made the difference. And as I continued to utilize these various practices and interventions, I made a lot of headway. And the practices and the therapeutic interventions that proved to be the most effective, I continued with them. The system of meditation practices I developed, well, I've been doing them for years. And even though I'm not dealing with the emotional wounding or the trauma that I experienced early, years ago, it's I find that as I continue to do them, it enables me to further develop my body and mind and develop increase my capacities, develop greater capabilities, continue to rarely do I ever find the opportunity to work with a very gifted healer. There's very few people in this day and age, unfortunately. Maybe if I have the opportunity to go to Brazil or something, I may get to find someone. Uh, but I do lots of deep tissue body work, for instance. Very important therapeutic intervention. And for many years now, I've been going back to the Wichita Mountains. I go on the Vision Quest, where I go out to fast the 4 days and nights without food and water. And I've gone dozens of times. As I continue to do so, I, this facilitates this ongoing process of transformation through which I continue to heal and evolve and develop to progressively higher levels. So we need to thoroughly test out these various practices and interventions and really determine. It's only through giving them an opportunity to work is that we get a sense of how they can truly benefit us and how we truly derive the benefits that these practices and interventions can, the healing and growth, the evolution that these practices and interventions can facilitate for us. So one of the biggest challenges that I face in working with people in our modern day world is that vast majority of people have never learned to work effectively with their own emotional responses. We weren't taught. And so from an early age, and things are upsetting or painful or difficult or stressful, causes distress, whatever, we tend to avoid those things. There's this kind of mentality of like, oh, don't go there. Just pretend it doesn't exist. Distract yourself. And so that's what we learn. We learn to distract, to avoid issues that are uncomfortable. We suppress our emotions, we push them down. And and consequently, what I find working with people is that people tend to hold just enormous amounts of just years of undigested, unprocessed emotions and stresses, everything that hasn't been processed that has accumulated in their body. And it's not just years, it's decades, like a lifetime. So when I first start to work with people, there's that lifetime of all this accumulated stress and unprocessed, undigested emotions. And what does that do? That creates like a huge amount of stagnation in the body. It's all this thick, congealed, dark, murky, congestive residue. And for some people, especially the abdominal region, it becomes like this like putrid, toxic waste dump. All that, you think about all the you your leftovers, you put them in the fridge and you forget about something. You find it weeks or a month or so later, and it's a science experiment. It's no longer edible, it putrefies. And so all the stress and emotion that gets trapped in our bodies, and we don't process it or digest it, it just backs up, and it's this heavy, congealed, putrefied residual. And, as I work with people, the first, oh, and there's also this armoring. There's the more this thick congealed stuff, but there's also this chronic layers of stress and tension that are just held in different parts of our bodies. And so I'm first working with people, and it's dissolving, cleaning up, purifying, doing this cleansing, purging process of all this toxicity that's accumulated in their bodies. There's a lot of it that's just purged from the body, and then a lot of this stagnant emotional residue that has to be taken. I work as a conduit, allowing this extraordinary, powerful presence to work through me, and it's taking all that stagnant, toxic residue, and it's like purifying, it's transforming, extracting the waste product. But a lot of that emotion, that's a part of your essence. It needs to be transformed, transmuted, and then you reintegrate it in this purified form. It becomes fuel for growth. So that's a pretty involved process to do. And usually the first, I'd say 3-4 sessions are usually just dissolving these layers of all this stagnation and stress and toxicity and armoring. And then we get into like session 4, session 5 and 6, and that's when the body's starting to become very fluid and responsive. And then session 6, 7, 8 and beyond, that's when the body becomes very malleable. And being that I work as a conduit, I have this extraordinarily powerful presence working through me. And people actually describe feeling, they just, their experience as they describe it, they say it feels like surgery taking place within their body. And there's this repairing of internal organs or repairing of injuries within the body. Some people say they feel something like hands going into the body doing reconstructive work. So it's an extraordinarily powerful process. But what's important is that we give the healing process an opportunity to work. And for many people, because their bodies are so numbed out, so deadened, holding so much stagnation, so much toxicity, they have to go through that initial cleansing, purging process. A number of people, like within the first couple of sessions, maybe like 1 out of 8 or something, tell me that they were in the toilet and having these huge bowel movements or diarrhea. It's just like all this like backlog of toxicity in their abdomen, just like cleansing, just purging from the body. Maybe like 1 out of 30 people might even get nauseous or throw up or something. It's okay. It's just pretty intense, powerful cleansing process. The other thing that happens is, as I work with people, it's like all these emotions begin to surface, the years and years of the emotional wounding, the trauma. And I make an effort to call, to check in, to see how people are doing. As I work with them, I want to know that they're doing well. And if necessary, I will hold their hand through the process as these emotions come up and go the extra mile to help them manage those emotions. And and so most people not understanding how to work constructively with their emotions, to work with those traumas that they've held for years and decades. That's why it's so important to listen and to follow instructions, because those who fail to do so, sometimes people run when the emotions surface. And if that happens, what's very likely to occur is they're just going to push everything back down. Maybe they self-medicate with alcohol, other recreational drugs. They're binging on food and refined sugar. Are there psychotropic meds and stuff? And then it all gets pushed back down there. And oh well, too bad, too sad. healing is aborted. And so the healing of the trauma, the deep emotional wounds that could have occurred, that would have happened had they listened, follow through, well, it didn't. Conversely, those who actually do listen, who follow the instructions, those who continue to work with me, and step by step, we're digesting more and more of this backlog of stress and all this backlog of residual emotion, healing, transforming these deeply traumatic wounds that they hold. They're digesting those traumatic events, and in stages, as these wounded, traumatized parts of self, they're healing, they're being transformed. These parts of self are emerging, they're becoming like, they re-emerge as these new parts of self, that newly functional parts of self that they could integrate. And so I'll watch these individuals as, before, some deeply traumatized, deeply wounded, and they become much more resourceful, much stronger, much more resilient, more capable, expanding their range of emotions, much more engaged in life, far more present. The quality of their relationships improve, their physical health dramatically improves. They're, people with all kinds of things, digestive and respiratory disorders, reproductive issues, and all these things. I've worked with women who were facing, they had a hysterectomy scheduled, for instance, and I'd work with some of these women, and like fibroids or ovarian cysts would dissolve. And one woman who was facing hysterectomy, for instance, and after a few sessions, they canceled the surgery. It's like she didn't need to go through it, and still has her uterus and ovaries. So there's, when people actually listen and follow through with the healing sessions and do work with the practices I teach them in conjunctions, this profound healing that takes place. And again, I feel it's, as I said, it's important to, it's not about following blindly. We all need to be, have a certain healthy skepticism of that. We need to question. But at the same time, there's also individuals that, when you have an opportunity, as I have, if you've grown up in one of these ancient traditional cultures like you find in India and China, although there's a lot of dysfunction there as well, there are certain individuals that possess these gifts or these transmissions that have been passed down through centuries and among Native Americans. And so individuals such as myself and these other individuals who've attained mastery in their discipline, we work as what you call intermediaries. And so we act as conduits to allow this extraordinary presence to come through. And both in my training with Shifu Li Tai Liang, with Horus, both of them indicated to me that, this is not something you're just going to come upon on your own. I mean, there were some instances among the Native Americans, some just of their own volition felt possessed to go to the mountain to do a vision quest, and they received some gift of healing, but at least they had some kind of framework, from, the culture in which they grew up. They had some kind of a roadmap that helped them to get there. And some of them did receive extraordinary gifts or healing powers by going through the vision quest. But people in our modern day world, for the most part, that's lacking. You don't have that. And so it's very unlikely that you're going to happen upon that on your own. And, for me, so getting to train with Shifu, getting to train with Horus, it's like both of them are connected to a lineage And behind them, there's all these other individuals that through the centuries had attained very high levels of mastery. And so even from the other side, there's that connection. There's that transmission of power that's passed down through the lineage. So if you have the opportunity to work with myself and other people in these other lineages who have attained these varying levels of mastery, these gifts of healing, this it can be of great benefit to you. So covered a lot of ground here. Is there? I don't think there's anything else I need to add for today, but but yeah, I guess I think I'll leave you with that for now. So oh yeah, if you enjoyed what you've heard, be sure to click like. I should have mentioned that earlier, and then also subscribe to my YouTube channel and share if you feel this will be a benefit to anyone else. Please share this video with anyone else that you feel will benefit from what you're hearing. And also, for those of you, for a limited time, I have a certain limited number of openings. So if you're struggling yourself in relationship or dealing with certain health-related challenges, whatever, so I'm offering like challenge resolution, heart-mending strategy session. I'll post a link below. You can take advantage of the opportunity to spend some time with me, and if there's other resources I feel make a difference for you, I'll be happy to share that with you. Or if I could be of assistance, I'll share that with you as well. Anyway, gotta go. Bye.